preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I'm not going to say much about the work, and rather let the slides speak for themselves, and then we can discuss it later during the discussion. This house was designed in 1979 in Greenwich, Connecticut. It's the center of a large estate where horses are bred and trained. The client clearly wanted to evoke the image of a great Virginia mansion. This is the Treaty Room Suite at the State Department, the brainchild of the previous Secretary of State, George Shultz. Mr. Shultz wanted a room which has never existed in the State Department, where the 400 or 500 treaties a year that the United States signed could actually have a formal setting. And we took a series of rectangular hallways and carved out of that space an oval room with two anterooms. The decorative motif around the door that you see as the entrance to the suite has as its theme the peace rose, which is, you can see it here, which is an English rose that was cultivated during World War II. This is one of the elevator lobbies at the State Department, which lead to the suite of the Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary, and the Treaty Room Suite. A Doric order which has as at its neck a band of 5 pointed stars from the American flag. The Fifth Avenue facade to Bergdorf Goodman. The Bergdorf asked for a new facade on the lower two floors of Fifth Avenue. They wanted new entrance, and they also wanted small and large display windows, and they wanted everyone to think that this facade had been there all the time. It should be new, but also old. This is the courthouse in Manchester, Connecticut. In the late 70s, the state legislature in Connecticut changed the structure of the court system, and the small town of Manchester, about 20 miles east of Hartford, had exactly 20 months to realize a felony court venue. Given that the state of Connecticut takes on an average 5 years from start to finish to build a new courthouse, I recommended to the Chief Justice that they buy an empty supermarket. For those of you who are connoisseurs of supermarkets, the two extreme walls, which are of white glazed brick, will give it away as a First National. This was an extremely low-budget project. It had really been budgeted for a very straightforward concrete block with a bit of paint on the outside and drywall and concrete block on the inside. Almost everything you see on the outside and inside of this building came out of Sweet's catalog, and the whole thing was realized in 17 months from start to finish. The executive offices of Simon & Schuster in Rockefeller Center. This is one of the clerical areas with wide shelves so that books, papers, and other materials can be left there. We actually cleaned the office for this photograph, but usually they piled high with papers, and a very elaborate lighting system over the central area. And then all of the doors are glazed so that everyone sitting here will see through these glazed doors outside light and the view to the other buildings of Rockefeller Center. This is a small house of just under 3,000 square feet, completed on a low budget in Greenwich, Connecticut. We have here the addition to the Miller Center for the Study of the Presidency on the campus of the University of Virginia. The large building to your right is the Faulkner House. It's a Greek Revival building which is on the National Register. The facade that you see was colonialized at the turn of the century, and in the late 70s, the building was taken over by this institute. They decided 4 years ago that they needed an addition. They needed more space. And for better or for worse, I was the third architect they hired. Like Bergdorf Goodman, they wanted a building which was new. There's a very elaborate and carefully designed lecture room inside with video equipment and all of the latest audiovisual aids. But they wanted it to be both distinct, to reflect the fact that it's new, recognize the donor, but to fit into the ambiance of the Jefferson's Academical Village, and also to relate to the Faulkner House because it was reviewed by 6 or 7 bodies concerned with historic preservation. So here you have the Faulkner House, and on the left, the pavilion with its hyphen that makes the connection between old, which stops here, and new here. This hyphen is completely glazed. It has shutters on part of the windows to give some protection against the sun. You'll notice that the intercolumniation here is actually wider than the older house. And in fact, there's a slight conceit here in that this building is simpler and slightly less elaborate and less correct in its handling of the orders. And you might say that this was a building on a farm to which a later and much more elaborate house was added. The inspiration for this particular wing is the great house Bremo, just outside of Charlottesville, which was thought for many years to have been designed by Jefferson, but was in fact designed by a local builder. This is further south in Athens, Georgia. It's a building for Morris Communications, who are the parent company of the Athens Banner Herald, which is the morning paper, and the Daily News, which is the evening paper. Billy Morris wanted a building which would blend in to the ambience of Greek Revival, Athens, Georgia, and also would give a new direction to the new development that is taking place in this town. Much of the architecture of Athens in the late 60s and 70s was not that successful, and he wanted to chart new territory. This is the main interior space. It's a 2-story skylit lobby where all public business in this building can be conducted. There's an information booth, and then the various windows on the side, like the telecages in a bank, where you can place your ads or order subscriptions, etc. The interior is polychromed using the same colors that the ancient Greeks did. This is a large house, a masonry house that is now under construction in Greenwich. I'm sorry, in northwestern Connecticut. This is a housing project growing out of the house that I showed you earlier in Greenwich, a series of small houses, about 1,900 square feet each, 3 stories high, built around a common green, and there is an outer layer of houses which surround this. This is a large inn and conference center outside of Richmond, Virginia. The inn itself, the conference center is in the top right-hand corner. Just below that, you have the inn with its porte cochere. and it's arranged in a series of U-shaped courtyards. And on your left, over here, you have a small green with a series of buildings around it, and one can either rent rooms or entire buildings or groups of buildings for families to meet over Thanksgiving, Christmas, etc., or for companies to retain for a large staff meeting. Again, the client wanted something which grew out of the Virginia tradition of architecture. This is a project, unrealized, for a memorial to the dead of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, which was planned for Battery Park, the south end of Manhattan, where so many immigrants from Europe landed and walked up this route to the Lower East Side or Hell's Kitchen or whatever other destination they had in Manhattan. This is 186 foot high. The Torah, the scroll of the law, is the keystone, and on the cone, which is hollow above, forming an oculus, you have 10 panels, and in each panel you have one of the 10 commandments. It is the triumph of the law over the madness, the insanity that Nazi Europe stood for. This is my newest and perhaps most challenging project. It is 2 office buildings on the north side of St. Paul's Cathedral. These face onto the side of Sir Christopher Wren's choir, and the address is number 2 and number 4 St. Paul's Churchyard, which is probably, together with Buckingham Palace, the greatest address you could have in London. Again, it is a project I'm doing with a group of other architects. We are the 3rd or the 4th group to work on this. And our idea was to do a building, at least my idea here, was to do a building which grows directly out of the tradition of Sir Christopher Wren. That's very close to my heart because Wren, working in the period of William and Mary, and the time of England's glorious revolution, obtained the rights. Englishmen obtained the rights that Americans fought for in 1776. But again, the idea was to do a new building growing directly out of the living tradition of English architecture. Finally, this is a design for a small jar. It will be in production by Steuben sometime this year. And finally, another design for a jar, this time to be in silver, for which I'm negotiating with a company in New York to produce. Thank you.
Start by asking what may in some ways be the most obvious question, and the one that you may have answered so much you tire of it, but I'll ask it anyway, which is why classicism? Why is this architectural language superior to others? Why, for you, is it the only one that appears to make sense at this moment?
Well, that's a question one could write a book about. I think the answer is really quite simple. If one switched from classical architecture to the English language, the question would be absurd. Whether you are James Joyce, Thomas Pynchon, Charles Dickens, Pope, or Shakespeare, English is a vehicle which is used in time as each generation wants it. And it's molded and has been more than adequate. The case of architecture is really the same. If one wants continuity, and the notion of continuity is fundamental to the notion of a city, A city without continuity is just an agglomeration of buildings. A political structure without continuity is just a series of arbitrary acts. I think we look to architecture to reinforce the social, the political, the religious beliefs that are fundamental to any structure. And classical architecture is simply the most sophisticated language of architecture that we have. It's 3,000 years old. It was born at the same time as the very notion of democracy was in ancient Greece. It was reborn in that same guise in 1776 in the United States. It had many lives between 1776 and the Athens of Pericles and the Republic of Rome. It was used by different religions, by different royalists, by different aristocracies, by different oligarchical societies to express power and authority in various ways. But the notion of anthropomorphism, of a human-centered architecture, is classical. And it is indeed the most potent image of architecture that we have. And the fact of the matter is, the real reason it is difficult to answer this question and take such a long time is that the history of 20th century architecture has been so completely distorted. The bottom line is that every technological innovation of this century, from air conditioning to steel frames to the use of elevators, the electrification of buildings, the use of introduction of plumbing to buildings, was achieved in the late 19th century by classical architects. The actual technological innovations of modernism are really very small and quite negligible. To correct that history and to present, for example, the Singer Tower, designed in 1898, completed 4 or 5 years later, you have a building there that has almost everything in it and that the latest skyscrapers have. We may have gone a little bit higher, we may use lightweight metals, but the industrialization of the building site and of the building industry was achieved by the turn of the century in the United States. And in fact, the actual image of modernity that you see in Eric Mendelssohn's book when he came to visit the United States, and in the great Le Corbusier's book, Vers en Architecture, is an image of skyscrapers in Lower Manhattan, most of which were designed by people who had at one time or another worked in the office of McKim, Mead & White.
Well, there's no question that modernism was an aesthetic revolution more than a technological revolution, which I think is what you're saying. But let me go back to the earlier point about the analogy to a language, and I know I used it before you did, so I can't put all the onus of it on you, but nonetheless, it doesn't seem to me to entirely hold water, in that the tradition of this country is one of, while it's one of one language, our heritage has a wide variety of architectural styles intertwined and coexisting. It's a much more pluralistic heritage than our language heritage. So does the analogy really hold? I mean, what about Gothic architecture? What about so many other things that are not directly part of the classical language? They're nonetheless part of the American image at this stage of the game.
Everything you say is correct. But underlying all of the various styles of the 19th century, the shingle style, underlying even the Gothic with a K at the end of the 18th and 19th century, and in fact permeating the vocabulary of High Gothic architecture of the 11th and 12th and 13th century are classical forms. The notion that classical architecture is a style is true, but it's also false. The fact is that every vocabulary of architecture in the West other than Gothic is some manifestation or other of classical architecture. The Gothic architecture itself is permeated with classical forms. The three arches on the west front of a Gothic cathedral are an outgrowth of the Roman triumphal arch with its three archways. The section through a Gothic cathedral is very similar to a Roman basilica. That is not to say that Gothic architecture did not develop into an independent language of form. It doesn't quite have the richness and adaptability of classical architecture, but nonetheless it is something concrete in its own right. But the various stylistic movements in the United States, and I would include Frank Lloyd Wright in that, are in one way or another directly related to a central root, which is American classical architecture. And I agree with Paul, it is a very broad picture, but underlying the moldings and the various details, the architraves, the entrances to these buildings, you will find classical detailing.
But it's a long way from Allan Greenberg to Frank Lloyd Wright. So let's try to pursue that a little bit if we can. If we define classicism so broadly as to put it essentially at the root of all of Western architectural culture, which is what you're doing, which is not inaccurate, why then in your own work do you choose to focus on what might be thought of as a particularly narrow and direct stream of that?
Well, I have to say, of all the designs I showed you, the one that is most successful, sadly the one that is least likely to be realized, is the memorial to the Shoah. I would have to say for myself that a good deal of my work is trying to catch up, to learn what two generations of architects have forgotten. Classical architecture as a tradition between the late 20s, the early 30s, and the early 70s, when I opened my office, was a tradition that had waned. Perhaps its last great monument is the National Gallery of Art by John Russell Pope in Washington. I am largely self-taught, simply trying to learn the lost knowledge of building construction. And the National Gallery, the Morgan Library, these are among the most perfectly constructed buildings in the history of architecture. Learning the vocabulary and how to use classical forms and details has taken me a long time. I consider that I'm still learning. And there are leaps of imagination which I'm trying to make, which I've only succeeded in doing once in that one building. But while I'm trying to do that, one also has to master all of the manifestations of American architecture. If I did an addition to the Executive Office building in Washington, I would like it to grow out of that kind of architecture. The same is true for a shingle-style house, a colonial revival, a Greek revival. There's just an immense amount of knowledge to master. And all I can say is that hopefully I will do better tomorrow than I've been able to do today. So it's, in a sense, like someone writing a novel. There's an immense number of novels to read and understand in order to move that tradition 1 inch or 1 step or 1 mile forward, depending on one's ability.
So you would say then, it sounds as if you're saying very emphatically that your goal is not merely to replicate classicism, but to extend it, reinterpret it, to leave a certain contribution of your own within this language.
Yes, absolutely. I think the idea of replication is absurd. I have, for those of you who read Preservation News in Connecticut, you will see a an article I have written which, while it supports the whole notion of preservation, questions it in very fundamental ways. Preservation, to some extent, wants to stop the clock. It is an admission that for the first time in the history of architecture, we can't take down important and great buildings, because our expectation as to what will take their place is so negative that we'd rather keep what we've got. There is no generation of architects in the past that would have really agreed with or been able to understand what preservation means to us. I think it's very important. I support it. But the more fundamental challenge is to be able to do great new buildings. It seems to me that those of us who are fortunate enough to live in the United States, where we have the second developed democracy in the history of mankind, and mankind's political record is not very good, as we all know. We have the longest established democracy. We have freedoms which most people in the world simply dream of having, and most of mankind simply could not ever have conceived of. We live in a society that has much to criticize, and we are a very critical society, but it has much to celebrate. And it seems to me our architecture should be a celebration of this extraordinary world that we have made for ourselves. And although I love the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe, Norman Foster and other architects, I visit their buildings and sketch them and try and learn as much as I can from them, because I don't want to close the door on modernism, so to speak. I want to stand on the shoulders of everything that the past has produced and to make an architecture which represents the noblest ideals of this incredible country we live in.
Let me pursue that a little bit. Yeah, so you jumped into something that I was going to turn to. One of the things that has always both intrigued and impressed me about you as a ideological classicist, if you will, is that you do not seem, despite the nature of your own work, to be ideologically anti-modernist either. I mean, I remember years ago that book by Henry Hope Reed called The Golden City, which was one of the first tracts or polemics about classicism in the last generation, in which he showed a picture of some classical skyscraper or another juxtaposed against the Seagram building. And the classical skyscraper was deemed good because it had decoration and ornament, and the Seagram building was deemed bad because it did not have decoration and ornament. The classical spirit underlying the Seagram building seemed to have eluded him entirely. Can you talk to that a little bit in terms of your own perceptions? It is very rare and very striking to have an architect show us work like the Greenwich houses you showed us, particularly the Neo Mount Vernon estate, and then 10 minutes later talk about admiring Mies van der Rohe and Norman Foster.
Well, I think, first of all, in architecture as in art, to paraphrase Allan Greenberg, quality speaks for itself. And you have to be blind or stupid to walk up the ramp of the Villa Savoye in France and not be moved. You have to be blind and stupid to stand outside the Seagram buildings and not say, what a wonderful building. I think that while the Villa Savoye is a little house in the suburbs outside of Paris, one could perhaps level serious questions about Seagrams from an urbanistic point of view. I think the same is true of another favorite building of mine, which is Carpenter Center on the Harvard campus. It seems to me there are many ways you can relate a building to its context. My way is but one road to Rome. One of the more difficult and challenging ways is to take ideas in classical architecture and to rotate them through exactly 180 degrees, so that the building, in a sense, reverses the ideas and some of the values in the architecture around it. It becomes an object, in a sense, a great question mark vibrating in space. Carpenter Center, it's a cube like the neighboring buildings on Quincy Street. They are brick, this is concrete. They sit on the ground, this is lifted above the ground on pilotis. They face the street, this is turned on the diagonal. You walk around those buildings. Carpenter Center, you take a great ramp and you walk through the middle. It's a very intellectual and a very challenging way of looking at urbanism. If you do 179.9 degrees, you fail. It has to be precise and exact, and it needs the genius of Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe to pull it off. And I love those buildings. Norman Foster's office building in Ipswich, I think, is another example of a successful building like that. The difficulty is that those buildings become more tied to their existing surroundings, which animate them, than a normal building. When Seagram's lost its context, and other than the building, the Racquet Club across the road, all of the masonry buildings, which determine the strange massing behind the tower, have gone. And you have imitations, terrible imitations of Seagram's on either side of it. And the danger of this approach to architecture is that when you lose your context, the building loses a good deal of its tension. The other problem with modern architecture, of course, is urbanism, the notion of continuity, of building beautiful streets, and the fact that the vast majority of buildings in any town, village, suburb, or great city are going to be designed by non-architects or architects of average ability. And classical architecture has conventions which are available for people to follow to produce good background buildings. And these are the buildings which animate London and Paris and Amsterdam and Florence and Rome and much of New York. It is what we miss when we walk down 6th Avenue from Central Park, or we walk up the new sections of 2nd and 3rd Avenue, which don't belong to New York. You don't know whether you're in Singapore or Johannesburg, South Africa, or Houston, or any other place. They just don't belong to any time or place. So, yeah, well, I'm rambling.
No, you're here to ramble. That's what you're here for. In a sense, though, isn't the battle partly won? I mean, what you're saying, particularly what you're saying about urbanism, is hardly a radical notion right now. I mean, we hear it said by everybody, including, indeed, many of the architects who a few years ago were designing those very glass towers that we're talking about. And maybe we hear it most of all by the figure I want to ask you next about, which is Prince Charles. You have been critical of some of what Prince Charles has said and done. You might be thought logically to be his greatest champion. Can you talk a little bit about, recognizing that now as one of the architects of the square around St. Paul's, you're benefiting from the movement in England that he's set off. But let's put that aside for the moment, and if you can speak as a kind of objective critic of the Charles phenomenon. Can you talk about it?
Well, let me say this. I think the most remarkable aspect of Prince Charles is his notion that leaders should be exemplars. And I have a deep admiration for his intervention in areas of English life, the poor quality of its hospitals, he's focused on it, the race problems of London, the plight of the poor, and so on, in ways that more active politicians should really have done. And I admire his sense of a leader or a future leader being an exemplar. As to his ideas on architecture, I think that the critical brouhaha that has surrounded them has sort of blown this out of proportion. On the one hand, Prince Charles simply presents himself as, an ordinary Joe, in quotation marks, who is looking at the English countryside and English cities and saying, what has happened to London? And indeed, the plight, what has happened to London is a catastrophe. What has happened to the English countryside? Well, that's been going down the tube for 200 years, but what's happened since World War II is indeed serious. The English countryside, I think, is one of the great collective creations of mankind. It's a nation whose entire landscape is man-made, manicured, created into this extraordinary manifestation of art, really. It's a work of art. And he's asking questions, what has happened to this? He's focused very pointedly on the political process by which great urban decisions are made. How subsidized housing is built, how urban redevelopment projects are formed, who decides what. This was the old question from the late 60s in this country, who decides what? Every forum on urban renewal, public housing, and so on raised that question. And the most interesting manifestation of his book is this question mark, who decides what? Why don't the people who live in areas have a say about what is going to happen? There is, unfortunately, in England, because it is still very much an aristocratic society, the association of the aristocracy, of the king, of the future king, of England's class structure, which I fled. I went there as a student in 1959. I stayed 10 weeks at the Architectural Association, and I fled. And it's still an experience which I think about a lot. It was a society that I did not then feel at home in. I think one of Mrs. Thatcher's great monuments is that she's changed England so much. But this is the downside, I think, of Prince Charles's point of view, and that of many of the people who have surrounded him. My interest is really in American architecture. People ask me why I've never been to Rome, and I say, well, when was the last time you went to Annapolis or Washington or Charlottesville? Because the kind of architecture we are talking about, the kind of environment that we should be building in metropolitan New York or in metropolitan Washington, and if you ever drive through Fairfax County, land which was, much of which was owned by George Washington and ridden across by the founding fathers, and you look at this terrible hodgepodge of buildings, you have one of the great failures of architectural imagination in the history of architecture. After all, societies since the Greeks have taken for granted the fact that we can build nice cities. And we all traipse to Europe, all the time to look at nice cities and the nice background buildings you see to the great monuments of architecture. We forget that St. Paul's, which I'm building next door to, was once a Gothic cathedral, which was demolished after the Great Fire of 1666. And when it was taken down, the Anglican hierarchy knew that Sir Christopher Wren was going to do as good a building as the one they took down. And this was a high Gothic cathedral. When 4 presidents voted to take down the Bullfinch Dome of the United States Capitol and asked Thomas Hugh Walters to rebuild it, they expected they would get something better, as they did. When Pope Julius in 1507 said to his architect Donato Bramante, "Take down St. Peter's, the most venerable building in Christian Europe, a building that went back to Roman times," this was an act of courage. Also had within it expectations that he would get a great building in its place, a different one. For us, when confronted with the west front of the United States Capitol, which we have recently rebuilt, we are the first generation in the history of American architecture that has rebuilt a section of the United States Capitol rather than develop an appropriate west front, which reflects the scale of Walter's Great Dome. Given the state of architecture today, I would have voted to rebuild the west front. But nonetheless, one has to look at this decision as a great affront to the creativity, to the ability of the profession of architecture today.
It's interesting. Your classical polemic is very much not a conservative one. There was a moment there when
I'm a populist.
Almost wanted to say this is all pretty radical for a conservative, isn't it?
But I'm not a conservative.
Right, exactly. You're not, and
yes.
In fact, we tend, by association, not by any real rationale or logic, to assume that classicism equals conservatism.
Well, that's wrong. The dome of the United States Capitol, as it was conceived by Latrobe, initially by George Washington, the idea for a dome, the first real dome to be built in the United States was George Washington's. And the dome, as built first designed by Latrobe, realized by Bullfinch, rebuilt by Thomas Hugh Walters, is, in my opinion, the single most radical architectural gesture in the history of architecture. You have, for the very first time, a dome, which is a symbol of the cosmos, of a whole world, which has underneath it neither religious nor political icon. There is no king, no religion represented under this dome. It is, in fact, an empty space. It is the conceptual center of the United States. It is an empty space which belongs not to the Congress, because the House is on one side, the Senate is literally pushed off to the other. The president is shunted off down Connecticut Avenue. That empty space, Pennsylvania Avenue, sorry. That empty space belongs to the people of the United States. It is dedicated to the right of assembly for any purpose, including political. It is where people gather to lobby, to influence legislation that determines the future of this nation. It is a classical architecture. You couldn't do it in any other architecture. The symbol of the cosmos is a classical dome. The land grant colleges of the United States, built in the 19th and early 20th century, the public library system of the United States represent the public school system of the United States as it was created in the 19th and 20th century. These are products of a great democratic society. No other society of the time had these facilities. And the language that was used to realize these buildings was largely classical or Gothic architecture. And when you look at, you drive down the East River Drive and you see the new School of Maths and Science by McKim, Mead and White, what's it, 116th or so. It's a classical building, but it's not a classical building the Romans or the Greeks or the architects in England in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century would have recognized the windows are too big, it's too repetitive. It was supposed to be an open building. It had lots of doors, so that many of these buildings were used as night schools to teach new immigrant groups English and so on. These are building types whose history has not been written, that are uniquely American and are radical social, political, and architectural statements.
Wonderful. We have a number of interesting questions, so let me turn to a few of those for a while. What kind of addition would you design for a Mies van der Rohe building?
Well, I have one to a Marcel Breuer building. That is a hard question. I've often asked myself what Mies would do if he had to add to a Schinkel building. And in fact, Mies, as we all know, designed the project for the Kröller-Müller Museum in Holland, which was a classical building, very much in the idiom of Schinkel. I suppose the answer...
The little Houston Museum, too, is Mies adding to a classical
small
Beaux-Arts building.
That is correct. And the original addition to that is one of the most eloquent additions I know. And I know they're reworking the Houston Museum, and they should uncover it. I suppose it would depend on the context. I could see myself doing a Schinkelesque addition to a Mies building. But I could also see myself doing a Mies addition to a Mies building. And one of, I think, perhaps the great, let me put it this way, my favorite post-World War II American building is by a student of Mies van der Rohe. It's the Great Civic Center in Chicago, which was designed by Jacques Brownson for C.F. Murphy. Brownson was a disciple of Mies, worked for Mies's office for many years, but the building really extends the Miesian vocabulary into new areas. It's an extraordinary structure. It has great cruciform columns. Whereas Mies divided his windows equally between columns, Brownson divides his windows on the center lines of columns, so you get small ones where the windows run into the columns, and then as the columns decrease in size as they go up, so the windows get big. It's an amazing building, and that's a challenge I would love to do. So depending on the context, one of those two ways.
The Brownson building also, in a sense, kind of synthesized the tradition of the Chicago window with the Miesian tradition. I thought quite brilliantly.
Yes.
But what is the Breuer building that you have added to?
Well, I really can't say much about it, but it's a design I'm working on now.
Because it had always, I can say this, I think I once said it in print, that it had always been my thought that strategically what the Whitney Museum should have done was hire you to build a classical building to the south of the Whitney Museum, which I
think that's a great idea.
But they then could have we could have begun to perpetrate the myth that it had been a full block long.
Yes.
And that Marcel Breuer had cruelly taken down the north end of your thing to build that insensitive addition a few years later. This next question is, do your clients who ask you to build private residences understand your notions of reinterpreting classicism, or do they generally look to borrow the prestige of the past and thereby require mere imitation rather than reinterpretation?
It definitely the former. I think the great movements in American architecture, in particular the City Beautiful movement and the preservation movement recently, have been grassroots movements. It has been the architectural profession pushed, propelled by grassroots into the future. And while most my clients may not be able to articulate what they want with the precision that Paul or an architectural historian could, they really do have a deep sense of what they want. And I don't do replication, so if they wanted that, they wouldn't come to me. There are other architects they could go to for that.
Sure, but I think the questioner has an interesting point that in many ways many clients may not want classicism for the both noble and subtle reasons that you've articulated tonight. They may see in it merely a kind of surface elegance and not more. Perhaps that doesn't matter.
I think I would not be flattering my clients by saying that by and large they know exactly what they want, which is why they come to me. Mm-hmm. My practice really exists in a corner of the architectural profession, and they're great public commissions I would love to get, which don't come to me. But yes, one of the motives of somebody who wants one of my buildings may be to have some of the pizzazz of a great English country house or something like that. But underneath, as we work through the design, and I involve myself very deeply with my clients, I take what they say very seriously, and I have been blessed with some wonderful clients from whom I've learned a great deal about architecture. And by and large, if they want the veneer, they will part company with me and go to somebody else.
Right. Good. Let me switch away from these for a moment, ask you another question about public commissions. When you did receive one public commission of extraordinary symbolic importance, which was the State Department. Can we talk a little bit about that, about how it came to be, and about what the experience of working within that huge and banal bureaucratic building that you were charged with remaking the interior of was like? And then a final part of that question is, can anything be done, or should anything ever be done about the exterior of the State Department?
Well, the work in the State Department falls on two different floors. On the top floor, you have the diplomatic reception rooms, which are really the brainchild of a very remarkable man, Clement Conger, who raised money on his own to assemble one of the great collections of Americana for the State Department, feeling that visitors to the United States should, in this building, see the great glories of American decorative art, painting, etc., and also its architecture. Mr. Conger also raised the money for the work I did on the 7th floor, but there was a second person involved who was a very remarkable man, George Schultz. And George's first comment to me was that he wanted an office in which Thomas Jefferson, as the first Secretary of State of the United States, could walk into, 200 years later, look around, sit down and start working and say, this is a terrific office. There are a lot of architectural details here that I didn't know about or wouldn't have thought about, but yes, I know this is the nation I helped create. In other words, they wanted to represent in architecture the continuity of American diplomacy. Everything about those rooms, including the fact that they were designed in 3 weeks, plans were done in 12 weeks, and the building was done in 16 and 24-hour shifts in 4 months between a NATO ministers meeting and some other series of meetings, bespeak modern technology. Everything, you couldn't have, an 18th century carpenter could not have produced that. You needed 20th century computerized shapers where you take raw lumber and you put it in one end, and these beautiful moldings come out the other. It's all air-conditioned. It has very elaborate security installations. Jefferson would have been fascinated by all of that. And George Shultz wanted an office which he thought represented the noblest aspirations of this country. And that foreign heads of state visiting our Secretary of State could come to and feel something special about the United States. So those rooms represent also this man's vision. And he looked at the original design I did. He made some suggestions. And then he said, basically, go to it. And he visited the site almost every day. He never said anything to any of the workmen, just walked through. The staff of the State Department, of course, hate all this because the noise level of the demolition and the metal work, the ducts and so on that are installed was tremendous, that you could hear this throughout that complex. But he wrote me a postcard one Christmas in which he said, everybody complains about the noise, but it's music to my ears, because having come from the Bergdorf Corporation, he always imagined himself as a great builder, which indeed he was. When everything was finished, the State Department gave a reception for all the workmen who had created this. They came with their families from Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, all over the place. And I was told afterwards that this was the only party, the only reception the Secretary of State ever stayed at from start to finish. What else?
Wonderful. My other question, which was only, can anything be done about the rest of the building? Or is it
well, I've been hoping
that building that it seems to me, if it has any emotional tie for diplomats coming from elsewhere, the rest of the building, it's that it reminds them of an airport.
Yes.
You know,
well, I can answer that question two ways. I would love to have a challenge like that, and I'm sure something could be done to improve it. The question of how you deal with the outside, precisely what architecture one would replace the existing one with, I think is a very interesting question. The building by its columnar structure is very repetitive, and to put the sort of anthropomorphic sense of a classical building on this would indeed be a great challenge. But I think it raises a much more fundamental question. And that is, the United States government was, until the late 30s, a great client of architecture. You've just got to look at the Federal Triangle, your local post office, the first national airport in Washington, government-funded land-grant colleges, and so on, the Mount Vernon Parkway, the Merritt Parkway, the Hutchinson Parkway, the national parks as a system, and the extraordinary architecture within the national parks, states, cities, and the national government were as great a client for the United States as indeed the Catholic Church has been to the history of Italian architecture. And the fact that it is almost impossible for a good architect to work for the federal government, and I certainly wouldn't dream of doing it, it is simply too onerous, raises, I think, an even more important, a more important question. Why did all of the great public buildings of the 19th and early 20th century happen? Through public agencies. There is an extraordinary public housing project in Bridgeport, Connecticut. You know, we tend to go through Bridgeport, you know, on the upper skyway of I-95 and not see this place, and it's the butt of Doonesbury and other jokes. But there's it is one of the first public housing projects in the United States. It's called Seaview Terrace. It's a series of little Cape Cod houses planned around with lots of trees and squares and so on, that was planned in 1919, which makes it 72 years old. It is still lived in and cherished. And 3 years ago, it was sold to its residents. Now, this is built by the city of Bridgeport with money from the city of Bridgeport, the state of Connecticut, and the Housing Bureau of the United States government, who hired a very good Boston architect, Clipsum Sturgis, who said, subsidized housing, well, poor people want exactly the same as what rich people want. At the time, in 1919, your idea was a nice little Cape Cod or Georgian house. And that's what he built for them. And immediately across the road, you have a 1930 housing project, a series of slab buildings, brick, which is now entirely set in asphalt. It has 6-foot-high fences with barbed wire with razor blades embedded in it around it. And it's not that the people who live in the two projects are different, but I think the architecture is different. And Paul's question begs a larger issue of why are our public architecture today so dismal? So the answer is the State Department couldn't be changed, but really should.
Of course. We really do not believe in the public realm as a challenge, as an entity, I think, today. Let me return to a couple of these questions before we have to adjourn. This one is not unrelated. Can your philosophy of architecture address the serious social problems that currently plague many American cities?
Well, I would say it's perhaps in the architectural component of what has to be a larger answer to that question. The answer has to be yes, because when you look at successful endeavors, you will find largely classical architecture. There is in the city of New Haven a building that has fascinated me for many years. It's the Scranton Street School. Scranton Street has been the center of a slum for the last 100 years. It was built in a slum, by that I mean an immigrant area, and is still in the center of one. It was recently sold by the city of New Haven and is now it's been adaptively reused as an office building, and its architecture really raped. But the Scranton Street School is a simple brick building, but it has enormous glass windows, one enormous window per classroom. It has 4 entrances. It occupies almost a whole block. It has 4 entrances, so that each side street has a stairway going up. Each entrance has 2 classical columns, and on one side, the main entrance, you have a very small pediment. But clearly, this was a low-budget building, and the architect made one gesture, a couple of columns and this little pediment. But it's a really beautiful building. It's not a great piece of architecture, but it's a fine one. But to me, it's always been a very moving building because it's set in the center of typical 2-story houses. 3 rental units, 1 in the attic, 1 on each floor, close together in what were, until redevelopment, quite densely planted with trees. This building was a beacon. It said, your school is a special place. Your school is the center of your community. Your school is a place everyone is welcome to. Your school is a temple of knowledge. It didn't have a Greek temple on the front of it, but it had the evocation of the notion that the pediment defines an important entrance. And we may not know that the pediment was reserved in ancient times for the gods, and in the Renaissance for the aristocrats and the kings of Europe. And pediments in America were statements that the rights of the gods of the ancient world and of the kings of Europe belong to John and Jane Citizen today. So the Scranton Street School is for me, has always been a very moving and a very beautiful building. And I think if you are going to intervene in cities, you are going to have to offer the poor and everybody else the best architecture. A wonderful story was told to me by Michael George. Michael George is a black man who loves McKim, Eden White. And on a tour many years ago, this goes back to the early 70s, of McKim, Eden White's buildings in New York, somebody asked him how come he was showing off all of this paraphernalia of the oppressive white class structure. And he said to this person, well, are you trying to say it's good enough for you, not for us? And I think there's a lot of truth in that. This architecture represents the best of America, and I think we should offer it to all our citizens.
That leads us into another question that asks you to comment on where classicism in the 90s will fit in, if at all, to affordable housing, prisons, and theme parks.
Theme parks have always taken care of themselves. The Great White City in Chicago, the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, had an enormous theme park. On one side of it, laid out by Olmsted with a great serpentine ponds and so on, and it was an immense success. So I have no problems with those. I think cities cater to honky-tonk as well as the Metropolitan Museum. They always have, they always will, and we should accept that. Affordable housing. I think we get carried away with technique always. One of the great tragedies of housing in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, including the housing of the London County Council, was that human beings were lost in numbers. Planners suddenly said, we don't have to worry about the quality of life in these places. We've just got to put a lot of point bar blocks, high density, and just jam people in and simply cope with emergencies. As you know, the London County Council now has the same housing project problems they've always had, but they're demolishing a lot of these buildings, as is occurring in this country. I think we should look at Seaview Terrace. And there is a whole generation of early public housing in the United States. I've looked at this in Connecticut a little bit. Its history has never been written. There is a parallel history of housing built by social democratic governments in Europe, the housing in Holland by de Klerk and Kramer and these other architects, which was very different from the sort of more canonical housing of Ode and the more radical modernistic architects. There is de Klerk in Holland, Per Olof Hallman in Sweden, Ein in Vienna. There's a whole movement in the teens of this century and the early 20s, when in Europe there was a great schism between the Social Democrats who wanted to improve the lot of the workers who were members of their party, and the communists who wanted to let things go downhill so they could foment a revolution. Helen Searing has written very eloquently of the problem in Holland in her dissertation, Worker Housing in Red Amsterdam. But that group of housing in Europe and the early public housing projects in the United States, I think, are rife with inspiration and ideas.
Absolutely. Good, thank you. A couple of questioners have asked, or taken by the mention of your teaching at the law school. Can you just very briefly say what it was you did there and how you happened to be an architect teaching at the law school?
I became, in the early 60s, I became very interested in Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. This was literally a mechanical prison It was a circular, seemed to me to be the first building which was determined solely on the basis of what we today call a functional analysis. You had the governor of the prison in a rotating cylinder in the middle, and around it a series of cages where prisoners were kept under constant observation. And Bentham wrote a book called The Panopticon, which was extremely influential in penology. The legacy of that book is still with prison design today. My own involvement in prison architecture was as a consultant to the Chief Justice of the state of Connecticut. And there was a juvenile detention center in Hartford, set in one of the sort of more rundown areas. Very handsome brick house, which I'm sure most of us would be happy to buy, fix up, and live in. And the kids from Hartford who had gotten into trouble were brought into this building, and they were kept there. The state of Connecticut built a new juvenile detention building, which in the space of 3 months was virtually demolished by the children. And I mean demolished. I'm talking about concrete blocks removed from walls with shoelaces digging out the mortar, solid core doors smashed somehow or other by distressed juveniles. I'm not saying that the inhabitants of these buildings are model citizens. Don't get me wrong, some security is needed, and one has to accept that. The difference was that the old building was just like the houses they lived in. First of all, it was a familiar building. And when you're brought into these places, you're under great stress. I think we feel some of that stress when you go into a hospital emergency room. It's a totally alien, unhome-like environment. The other thing was, of course, that in the old house, the staff had to mix with the kids. They ate with them. They were always talking to them. When there was a problem, they could get right on top of it because they were right there. In the new building, they were behind a glass wall, and they had a lot of electronic paraphernalia and just removed themselves from contacts, and the children felt like animals in cages. And I became very interested in this question of why? What happened between these two buildings? Both the new building was really designed and built with the best and the noblest of intentions, as was Bentham's Panopticon, which was not seen as an institution to hold people in cages, but as a place of moral improvement, one of whose children was the great Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, which was built by the Quakers. Anyway, my 2 years at the law school and a subsequent period of 2 years involvement in the Guggenheim program in criminal justice there was to teach a course called Pretrial Detention, Legal, Architectural, and Administrative Alternatives. And we had a law professor, Daniel Freed, whose work was in pretrial detention. I was the architect, could sort of figure out what buildings cost to build, finance, operate, and so on. And we had a brilliant young political scientist, then Suzanne Weaver, who eventually became Suzanne Garment, who wrote the Washington Observed column in the Wall Street Journal when she gave up academia. And we focused on just this question of pretrial detention. What do you do with people who are accused of a crime, nothing's been proven against them, who today are held in conditions that are far worse than most prisons where you have convicted felons? And it was a fascinating study of an institution which nobody can control. Judges send people to pretrial detention. The sheriff, who's in the executive branch of government, is a hotel keeper who cannot turn guests away. So they are always overcrowded, and it's an axiom that, it's axiomatic that the more cells you provide, the more people you'll have in pretrial detention. And then, of course, the legislature has to fund all of this, and they have no stake in it either. So you have this institution over which no one is really responsible, but everybody's yammering. And we focused on a number of different problems, one of which was the tombs here, and we did this course twice. And then in the Guggenheim program, we got various people from the police, the Brooklyn DA's office, the corrections department, and so on. And we had a series of roundtable meetings where everybody was present. We had a judge from Philadelphia who had written an important decision on this, and Judge Lasker from New York came up. And it was just fascinating experience to explore this problem. And more important for me was also the opportunity to work outside of architecture in a profession that is always levering at finding new areas of endeavor for itself, whereas architects, our field seems to be shrinking all the time.
Great, wonderful. Our time is almost up. Let me end with one more question from the floor, which is this. In what way are you a modern architect?
Okay, I'm sure I planted that question there. I can answer that number of ways. The first sentence of Palladio's book, the Quattro Libri, which was written in the 1500s, Palladio talks about himself as a modern architect. You are modern by virtue of designing in the present. The word modern, and I am modern in that sense. There is a great deal of confusion in architectural writing today between the word modern as representing the Enlightenment and modern as representing post-World War II architecture in America. And a great deal of ink has been spilled trying to connect the two. In fact, I don't think there is much connection, but my work is modern in the sense that it very definitely grows out of the Enlightenment. Thirdly, it is modern because it looks to the future and it tries to paint. I don't say I am successful in this, but it tries to define problems in the broadest sense. If you were a scientist and you rejected an area of science because you didn't like some aspect of the theory for ideological reasons, you'd be thrown out of your post in a hospital or university. Yet architectural historians for the last 50 years have been writing books which are gross distortions of architectural history. And for me, in addition to the Villa Savoye and the Seagram's building, some of the great modern monuments are the lost Pennsylvania Railroad Station. That is a steel-framed building. It handled the movement of people in a way that no building built after its time has ever been able to do. It was also a new synthesis of a multi-level transportation building. McKim Eden White succeeded in doing what no architect of an airport has ever been able to do. An airport's a great gateway. In comparison, they fail. We fail. So I think among our great monuments, I would put the National Gallery of Art, the Lincoln Memorial. We don't have too many modern buildings where people go and cry because they're so moved by what they see. Pennsylvania Railroad Station, the San Francisco City Hall, the Pasadena Civic Center, which is a monolithic reinforced concrete building. These are all buildings which embody more profoundly than Seagram's or the Bauhaus building, the industrialization of our world which occurred in the United States, and I am modern in that sense. I am not modern in the ideological sense that you see in the writings of Walter Gropius, of Nicholas Pevsner, and of Siegfried Gideon.
Good. Allan, thank you very much. It's a wonderful ending. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.